Tavern show, a show built around the game currently in development by Visionary Realms, Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen. The show is designed to build community around the game, and tonight I am very, very excited to have Nephele with us to talk all things Pantheon. So, welcome, Nephele. I'm going to bring you into the tavern here.
Fancy.
We're around the hearth for cheers. So, first question of the night, as this is the tavern, what are you drinking this evening?
Well, right now, I just have some water, but later on, I'm going to have an Irish coffee. I think it's a good way to end the night on a Thursday. It's a nice Irish coffee.
Well, we're going to keep you talking long and hard, so that I'm sure the water will come in handy. I'm drinking sorry, go ahead.
I said, let's do it.
All right. I'm drinking a Modern Times beer tonight. Just thinking of Pantheon being the modern version of the old MMORPGs that we love and cherish. Welcome, Tech Ninja. Thank you for stopping into the show. What are you drinking tonight? Nephele, what games have you played previously what's your sort of gaming history?
Yeah, it might actually be easier to ask what games I have not played. Let's see. So I got my start back in the mid-90s in college, actually in text muds. So I was this college freshman, and I was in the dorms, and my RA on the floor was like, "Hey, I want to show you this cool thing that we're doing. Come to the math lab after 8 o'clock." And I was like, "Okay, fine." Well, I don't know what they're dragging me into, but I'll go to the math lab. So I get there, and they're all in front of the old dumb terminals that were in the math labs way back in the day, right? And they're all playing this text-based game, and I'm like, "What is this?" And it was a mud, and so yeah, that's how I got my start with MMOs. Was actually is in text muds, and then from there it went to Ultima Online and EverQuest and Meridian 59, not quite in that order, and then like all the games that came out after EverQuest. I dabbled in just about everything that came out just because it was all new and shiny and cool, and I had way too much free time. Games that have stuck with me. So EQ stuck with me for a long time. EQ was something that really grabbed me, and I played it for a good 5 years or so. EverQuest 2 for different reasons. Another about 5 years there. Star Wars Galaxies for a good 3.5 years until changes happened that killed the game for me. Let's see, EVE Online was 11 years.
Wow.
I have no idea how I did that, but I did. Vanguard was a good 3.5 years from its launch until I just sort of lost faith. Final Fantasy 14 is going on 7 years. Lord of the Rings Online was like 3 or 4 years. And if I keep thinking, I'll probably keep rattling off games, so I'll stop. But yeah, I've played a lot of MMOs.
Excellent. So then what got you interested in following the development of Pantheon?
So I'm not actually sure what it was that like first tipped me off to Pantheon. It was back in like 2015. Somebody mentioned it to me, or I saw something about it somewhere, and I was like, "Oh, let me go check this out." And at the time, like the blurb that they had up on the website, or the blurb that I saw about it, was all about, you're like a fallen demigod, and you're working to restore your power. And I was like, "Oh God, that's not the game for me. I'm done."
Yeah.
Right?
It's a good thing I didn't see that one either.
Yeah. And then like, a year or so later, like in late 2016, I was out looking for a new game because I was getting kind of sick of the ones I was playing. And I was like, "Well, let me go see what this Pantheon thing like if that ever went anywhere. And of course, by then it had all changed. And I still, it still looked like it was very early. So I kind of just made a note of it and moved on. And then I checked back probably every couple of months just to see what was on the forums. And eventually it was the forum community that really drew me in and got me to pledge and got me invested in what Pantheon was going to be. But it wasn't anything that like VR said. It was what all the players were there looking for. And and I really identified with a lot of that. So yeah, that's what got me to start really following the development of Pantheon.
So really, the community is what drew you in.
Yep.
Awesome.
I know you guys are gonna be kicking yourselves for the rest of the year. Why didn't do that?
Well, that's the thing I love about the community is that it seems to be a very welcoming and diverse community. So we have a wide range, even though it's considered a niche game and it draws a specific.
It's not a niche game. It's not.
I agree, but I mean that's what they're calling it.
I mean, people like to say that because we think somehow that makes it cool and special, but no. The reality is that we all, even though all of us have many, many, many things in common, and that's what brings us together, we also all have very diverse perspectives. And I would say that Pantheon is not a niche game. It's a core MMORPG. It's if you think about what MMORPGs are supposed to be from a philosophical perspective, Pantheon is closer to that than the vast majority of games that exist today. And that's really why we're all here. So I don't think of Pantheon as a niche game. I think if Pantheon is done right, it's going to appeal to a very large number of people. And we're all going to be surprised just how many other players there are when we were able to get into it.
Well said. I completely. Speaking of community, I also want to welcome Vesuvian. Thanks for stopping in the show. Let's see. Oh, all right. So yes. Sorry, a little distracted tonight. I don't know what's going on. You are a big fan of sort of horizontal progression and non-combat content. Why?
Well, I'm going to blame it on having played, so many MMOs over the last 22 years. Eventually, after you do that long enough, you kind of get tired of just the hack and slash treadmill, where it's, oh yeah, I'm going to go kill monsters to level up, to get better equipment, to kill more monsters, to level up, to get better equipment until I'm at the end game and I'm raiding. And like, that's really all there is. But more seriously, if I think back to the best experiences that I've had in different MMOs, it hasn't been about the combat. It has, sometimes combat was involved, but it was more about being drawn into the world and really feeling like I was a part of that world. And feeling like it wasn't just on rails. Like there was a lot of things to see and do. I had choices. I could spend the day going out and trying to get some item, or I could go explore a dungeon that I had never seen, or I could even just go, spend time gathering and crafting and decorating my house or whatever. It was that breadth of experiences. That's what really sticks with me. Like, that's what makes me stay with games long term, is when I have a lot of different things that I can do. So to me, horizontal progression is extremely important. It's not just about pushing my level up or getting stronger, but it's about having more and more different experiences with my character in this amazing game world. And the better a game can do that, the longer it's going to keep my interest. And then as far as non-combat content goes, it's kind of along the same lines. It's the idea that not every interaction has to be about killing something. I like to compare MMOs to TV shows or movies, or even books, where if you think about the things that the characters do in those shows or books or movies, not everything is a fight scene, right? You know, there's plenty of times where the story is about the character or characters, you know, just talking with each other, getting to know each other, or doing something that's not combat related but still has tension to it, like they're racing to solve a puzzle, you know, or they're trying to uncover a mystery or solve a riddle or something along those lines. So there's a lot of dramatic tension that can occur that doesn't involve combat at all. And translating that to MMOs, it's the idea that there can be things that our characters can do that are fun and engaging and draw us into the world that don't have to involve casting a spell or swinging a weapon. A good example, I played, and I'm blanking now, The Secret World. I played The Secret World when it came out. And one of my favorite things about The Secret World was the investigation quests, where it wasn't about killing the monsters, but you were trying to solve the mystery, and you were going around and hunting down clues and following these clues to more clues to figure out what happened or what was the story. And for the most part, it was not combat at all. There was no combat involved, but it was really compelling content. So if you think about, you know, all the different ways, like with Pantheon, that the perception system can come into play, or even just the ability to go out there in the world and discover something that's, you know, that's still fun and challenging, but doesn't involve, you know, fighting something.
How do you think the Pantheon perception system compares to what you experienced in Secret?
So apples and oranges.
Okay.
They're both delicious, but you know, two different ways of doing things. So
Okay.
Secret World's, you know, investigation system was half in game and half out. Like some of the clues you would find would be like a video clip that they had uploaded to YouTube.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different,
All
right?
right. Yeah.
But what I like about the perception system in Pantheon is, you know, on the surface, it's basically just another way to do questing, which is fine. But what it gives us the ability to do, or what it gives, or so the experience that it enables for players is that you don't know that quest is coming.
Mm.
So in most other MMOs, you run into a town and you see the marker floating over the NPC's head, and you're like, oh, that guy's got a quest. Let me go talk to him. In Pantheon, you'll be out in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly you'll get a perception ping.
Mm.
And it'll be like, wait a minute. Whoa, what was that? Wait, I hear voices to the south. Oh, wait, what's to the south? Let me go investigate that. And it's very organic, right?
Yeah.
And then with like what they've showed off in streams, where, you know, depending on what other things you have done, you might get more or less details, or you might not even get that ping at all. You know, it means that no two players, or very, I don't say no two players, but it's very likely that you'll have a different experience as you progress through that than somebody else will. And when it's all said and done, you'll have different stories to tell. You know, and you might be sitting down in an in-game tavern talking to another adventurer, and you're like, oh yeah, last week I heard these voices to the south, and I found these bandits that were plotting to kill the merchant, you know, and I managed to gather some friends and fight the bandits off, and we saved the merchant, you know, or whatever. And the other guy's like, wow, I never even knew that was going on. Instead, he had a completely different adventure, because he had done different things or made different choices. And so I think that's the potential that the perception system has. And in a way, I think it's actually an evolution over anything that we've seen in any MMO before.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It'll be fascinating to see how it does play out once the game goes.
Yep. Yeah, I'm probably optimistic or over optimistic, and it probably won't be as awesome as I imagine it to be, but I can still hope, right?
Yeah. Well, who knows? At this point, I have a feeling we're all going to be, quite pleasantly surprised at how
I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, for sure. At least what we've seen from the streams really have me really excited. So, if you were, along those lines of sort of the horizontal progression and non-combat related content, if you were designing um, Pantheon, since we don't really know yet how their harvesting or crafting systems are going to work, at least I'm aware of that. You, how would you like to see those systems work in Pantheon, in the ideal Pantheon world?
So how much time we have? Because I could
we
talk about this
we've
for
got
a
at least a
long
couple hours, so
All right. So, I tend to think, and I've been involved in so many games, some of them as a tester, some of them, early in the community, some of them after launch even. And what I've noticed is that, and add to that the fact that in my day job, my real life job, I work in software development. I work with, I'm not a developer by any means. I'm a program manager, but I work with a bunch of developers, and I know that developers are people who like to solve problems in their own way. And the worst thing you can do to a developer is come to them and say, "Hey, I want you to solve the problem this specific way." So when I talk about this, I tend to talk about like, what are the goals? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And not necessarily about how do you do that, because I think that does a disservice to the developers. It's their job to figure out creative ways to solve the problem. But what we should really be talking about is the outcome that we want to achieve. So that's where I'm going to come at this from. When it comes to harvesting, the best harvesting experiences that I've had in a fantasy MMO were really in Vanguard. And there wasn't, for anybody who remembers, there wasn't anything really special about Vanguard's harvesting system other than group harvesting, but it was more about just the way that it was integrated with the world, where even though, yes, the nodes spawned in the same places and you could run a loop, at least initially, you still had to go out and really find those nodes. Like if you were looking for trees to cut down, you had to go find those trees. And the places where you'd find those trees were places where you would expect to find trees. So, there's a grove of trees on the riverbank. Odds are there's a couple of trees in there that you can cut down and harvest. If there was, if you were looking for ore to mine, you weren't going to find that sitting out in the middle of the plains. You were going to find it like in the rocky areas and the mountains. So it was the idea that, things kind of made sense in the context of the world. They weren't just obviously out there, for game purposes, but they were really there or they were really meant to be where they were in the world. So I think that's the first objective that I have for harvesting, is that it needs to feel realistic. It needs to feel like it's not just there to support the game, but that it's really there to be part of the world. The second objective that I'd like to achieve for harvesting, I'd like Pantheon to achieve for harvesting, is make it something that's not simplistic. It doesn't mean it needs to be super complicated, but there needs to be a little more to it than running up and clicking on a node and say, okay, I clicked on my node, I got my stuff, now I'm running off to the next node. Like, there needs to be some gameplay there, some depth, whether that's like different abilities that I can use, or different kinds of nodes, or different situations. Something, just add a little depth to it, make it a little more interesting and engaging than just running around clicking on things. And then finally, the third outcome that I would really hope for is Terminus in Pantheon it's a world that's dangerous. It's, and we've seen some of this in the streams where, it's not just like it's a world that's built around groupings. So the group challenges are everywhere. They're not just in the dungeons or just in the raids. And I feel that the other game that has influenced me a little bit in this regard is actually Final Fantasy XI. In Final Fantasy XI, if you wanted to go harvest stuff, you were probably headed to the dangerous places to harvest those things. And that's kind of what I want to see in Pantheon as well. Like, I'm okay with, outside the town gates, there's maybe a few things to harvest just to help people get started. But, if you really want to harvest stuff, you're probably going to have to go into more dangerous parts of the world, maybe even down into dungeons or into those bandit camps or whatever. And that's where the harvesting needs to be, because what that accomplishes is it makes harvesting a social activity. You know that you're not going to be able to fight off those bandits on your own. You're going to have to get some help. So now the reason that your group is going to fight the bandits is so that you can clear the bandits out and then mine all the ore that's in their camp, or something along those lines. Like that's the third objective that I'd really like to see Pantheon's harvesting system achieve, is to make harvesting not just a side activity, but really make it part of like that core adventure that we're all having.
For sure.
So yeah, I know none of that answered the question of like how would I design harvesting, but those are like the goals that I would want to try to achieve with it.
For sure. Well, that makes total sense. Yeah. Because ultimately that's what's important, right? That it is engaging, and that it does challenge us in a particular way, or beyond just going on and clicking on them. But that also means that then crafting, if people are going to have to work extra hard in a sense to gather materials and need a group to get, it's going to have to be important for the group's going to have to benefit, ideally benefit from that somehow, which would mean then that crafting would have to have some extra importance. So how would you see that tying in?
That's a great point. So the best crafting games that I have ever played have been the ones that were designed where crafting was really the source of the vast majority of things that players used.
Right.
So if I think back to Eve or Star Wars Galaxies, they were both crafting-based systems where literally everything that you were using, or the vast majority of things you were using, were crafted. Now, that doesn't quite work for Pantheon, because we know that Pantheon wants to have like a pretty strong loot component, right?
Right.
The idea that you go kill the dragon, you should get something for killing the dragon. But we can still make crafting very important in a couple of ways. The first and maybe the most obvious way is when you kill that dragon, you don't necessarily have to get a usable item right away. I mean, you probably still will some from time to time, but we don't need people going out on adventures and coming back with inventories full of like shiny swords and powerful armor, just drop after drop after drop that they're just going to end up selling or something because there's no way they could use it all, right?
Right.
So one thing that can be done there to balance the two is to say, hey, those usable drops are actually kind of rare. For you to find a breastplate that you can just pick up and use, or like a war hammer that is in good shape that you can fight with, that could be kind of rare. But maybe more often you're finding like that broken shield, or that half of a sword blade or something that on its own you can't really do anything with it, but you take it to a crafter and that crafter can do something with it. They can make something out of it. So that's one way to help sort of even that experience out. A good example, or an example from one of my tabletop days, is like you find a broken sword hilt, and if you look at the sword hilt, it's like, it obviously once belonged to a really nice sword. It's got like a nice gem on the pommel. It was obviously crafted with care, and something snapped the blade. Well, you take it to your friendly neighborhood blacksmith and you bring him the right materials, and he can reforge that sword and into a really powerful weapon. And if you think back to, or if you think about fantasy literature, like think about the War of the Rings,
Right.
or the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? In the Lord of the Rings, what's his name? I'm blanking on the name. Wow, I'm getting old or something. But in the Lord of the Rings, like they reforge a sword, right?
Right.
It's the Elven King's sword got shattered, and they gather at one point they gather all the pieces of it and they reforge it into a new sword. And so there's no reason that Pantheon couldn't do something like that. And then finally, the other thing to think about with crafting, and with making harvesting a more social and group experience. So we've established that crafting stuff should be good or should be useful, that it should be balanced with loot. But two other things we can do. The first is actually kind of funny. Like, how many pieces of ore does it take to make a shield?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, it could be one, it could be three, it could be 10. So you could think about balancing that way, right? Like maybe, if people are going out and they're bringing back like, armloads of ore, well, that's great, but maybe it takes a lot of that ore to actually make a usable shield, so that's one way that you can balance things. The other thing that you can do is you can set up a system where crafting isn't about making items in bulk. So it's if I'm let's say I'm a Fletcher, I'm not trying to grind out 3,000 arrows to advance my level. But instead, it's about making customizable items. So instead of grinding out those 3,000 arrows, I'm making 30 arrows that have a stun proc. So or maybe my ranger friend needs arrows that are that do fire damage or are effective against cold-loving creatures. My ranger friend is headed to Amberfate, and he knows that Amberfate is a very cold place, and so monsters there are probably resistant to cold, but weak to fire. And so he wants me to make some arrows that will work well against those creatures. Like the idea of that customization, that
Right.
the crafter is making you things that are tailored to your specific needs instead of just churning out generic equipment all the time.
Right.
I think that's something that I would want to see Pantheon do, because not only does that help balance things better with the loot, but it also helps the economy in the long run, where instead of everybody putting up dozens and dozens of things for sale and all trying to compete with each other, now it's much more about what are the items that people need specifically, and your needs might be different from somebody else's needs. And so crafters are much more about doing that sort of custom work. And if, I mean, sure, they'll put stuff up for sale that they've made, but the things that they put up for sale will be more likely to be different from each other because they're just going to go in different directions. I made a really cool sword with a strength bonus and a fire damage proc, and you made a two-handed warhammer with a constitution bonus and a life drain proc on it. Well, which one's better? That's what we should aim for, is we get a situation where it's a choice. It's not about which one has the best DPS, but it's about which one suits my needs better. And I think that's where we want the crafting system to get us.
That would be really amazing. If crafters are making fewer items, how would you see crafters, leveling or progressing their skill?
So there's a couple of different ways to that. I should caveat that I think it's really important that Pantheon's crafting system breaks the mold and gets people out of the cities, gets them out into the world. I don't want I don't want to see another MMO where crafting is a side game where you go sit in your house or you sit in the crafting area and you spend the whole day there doing stuff, and then whenever you leave that spot, you're not doing anything related to crafting. I don't want to see that. What I want to see is I want to see crafters going on adventures because they're trying to track down that fragment of that lost schematic so that they can make something new, or where they're trying to find the ancient master who's going to teach them the lost technique so that they can become a better crafter, or even just finding the materials to make the really important item that they've been asked to make. Like, do you want me to make you a suit of elven scale armor? Well, wow, I'm going to need some special stuff for that. I'm going to have to go out in the field to get those things. So what I would say for progression should come from all of those sorts of things equal. It should be about, making items should give you some progress, right? Should give you some experience or skill or whatever. But there should also be other ways to earn that experience or skill, whether that's completing content that's crafting focused out in the world, or potentially doing things to advance horizontally as a crafter. It shouldn't simply just be about climbing the ladder, right? There should be a lot of different things that you have to do if you want to ultimately achieve mastery of your crafting profession.
Cool. So, like in, well, this was more still crafting stuff, but I know in Vanguard, they had the work order and sort of the writ progression. Do you see something like that working in Pantheon, or
I do and I don't.
yeah?
So I like the idea of work orders or writs or whatever you want to call them, where you're making something for NPCs. But what I don't like is the fact that they're just essentially a repeatable turn-in that has no visible impact on the world.
Hmm.
So if we're going to have them, what I want to see is uh, I want to see them have a visible impact. And I talked about this in the forums last year. I think it was last year. But let's say that you're out adventuring one day, or you're out exploring the world or whatever, and you come across this rundown tavern. And there's the innkeep there, and he's inherited this tavern from his uncle who was killed in an orc raid, and he's trying to get it up and running. But man, the place is a wreck. Like, the furniture is all broken. There's cobwebs everywhere. His kitchen has nothing in it. The beer is terrible. And he's like, adventurer, I need your help. Could you please help me make my tavern a place where people would want to be? And so there's different tasks that you can fulfill for the tavern keeper, where, hey, you know what? You can go out there and harvest some stuff or gather some things to help him make new furniture, or you can even craft some of that furniture for him. You can go out and hunt game and bring him back the meat to help fill up his pantry so that he's got food that he can offer. And as you do these things, you're gaining coin and experience for helping him out. But you're also actually seeing the effects of what you're doing in the game world, where, you know what, he's got better furniture now, and it actually shows up in the tavern. Or maybe his kitchen's well stocked enough that he starts to get some traffic through, and now there's a merchant there who sells stuff. So the idea that over time players can, if they fulfill these tasks, these needs, they can not only help themselves through, they can progress, coin or experience or whatever, but they're also having a visible impact on the world around them. And then you can even set that up to make it dynamic, where if players stop helping the tavern keeper after a while, things start to decline. I use the tavern as an example, but there's so many different ways that you could apply this. Like, let's say it's a guard post on the road, and if you help the guards out with better supplies, they're better equipped, they become stronger, they're better able to fight off the monsters nearby. Maybe there's a few more of them, things like that. Or maybe it's something that's a little more permanent, like there's a bridge across a ravine that's been broken. And, you as a player help the workers repair the bridge. And once that bridge is repaired, now you can cross it to get to whatever's on the other side more easily. So there's a lot of different ways that you can implement this, the sort of idea of like a task or a work order, and still have it actually have more of an impact on the game world, and feel like it's less of just a method to gain experience or coin, and more about actively doing something in the context of the world that you're in.
I like that. I mean, I really like that idea. I love the idea of, you know, being able to make an impact and seeing the impact. The one concern I would see is like, then, so you've built up the tavern. The player that comes in 6 months later, all these things are done already. How do they progress their
Yeah, so that's sort of the trick, right? Is you have to hook it up to a system that says, hey, over time, new needs are generated, whether that's people stop helping the tavern keeper, so eventually like he needs some more help again, or maybe we've helped out the tavern keeper, but now there's a windmill down the road that needs help, or something else. And you have to have some sort of dynamic system that makes sure that there are always needs out there for players to fulfill, and that you never run out. Because that's one of the worst things that can happen, is when you come into a game 6 months or a year after it's launched, and like everything's already been done.
right,
That's no fun.
right.
So yeah, there has to be something to keep generating those new needs.
Sure. But yeah, I mean, if that were, they were able to work that out, that would be really exciting to me. That would be really exciting because, again, you're not flooding the market with all kinds of new materials, but you have a compelling reason to craft and make things and see an impact. Maybe you get also faction boosts or you get discounts, at
Yeah.
that tavern.
And it gets you out. I mean, for me, that's the most important thing is it gets you out and you're actually part of the world.
Right.
You're not just sitting in a corner churning out things for other adventurers to use. You're actually part of the game world at that point, and I think that's what's really important.
Definitely resonates with me for sure. Um, uh, we have welcome Tony for stopping in. Yeah, full entropy, sure. But I do hope that Pantheon doesn't have item degradation. I know that's a hot topic.
There are a lot of people who want it, and there's good reasons on both sides, right?
Yeah.
There's good reason. There's reasons why it's good for games, but at the same time, it's one of those things that's really hard to implement in a way that works for everybody. Every game I've ever played that had item decay, there was always some group of players, because of whatever they were doing, that felt the pain of that far more than others. And one of two things would happen, right? Either the developers would set it up so that it wasn't terribly painful for that one group and it was trivial for everybody else, or the developers would set it up so that it was fair for everybody else, but that one group was just like penalized. And so that's, I mean, it's a really tough thing to do. And, because of that, I like to look for ways to pull items out of the economy that don't involve actively destroying the ones that players are using. Because there's other ways you can pull items out of the economy, and that's ultimately what item decay does. Is it pulls stuff out of the economy.
Right.
Tech Ninja had a question in the chat that I'm going to try to address, and we'll see.
Excellent.
So he said, Neff, what do you think about some kind of infamy system with friendly NPCs, like, or master crafters and gatherers specifically? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by infamy, but what I think of is crafters are just as much a part of the world as adventurers. And so from an adventuring perspective, I feel like there are going to be different factions that adventurers can choose to align with. My example, if I go back to EQ, was in Velius, right? You were either aligned with the giants or you were aligned with the dragons. You weren't doing both. Although you could flip back and forth between them if you were really good at it, right? But it was the giants or the dragons, one or the other. And there were distinct rewards for choosing to side with one side or the other. I see no reason why you can't treat crafters and gatherers the same way. Like, hey, you know what? Maybe I really want to get in good with the Dark Mirror and learn their secrets of crafting. I don't know, I'll call it like Seaforge armor or something. Or, you know what? I actually really want to get in good with the dwarves because I hear they have this cold arc steel stuff that's really good and really strong. But you know what? The dwarves and the dark mirror don't really like each other all that much, and I can't really ally with both groups. So I'm gonna have to choose. Do I go ally with the dark mirror and learn their secrets? Do I ally with the dwarves and learn their secrets? Which do I do? And that's a really simple example, but I would love to see lots of different choices out there available for crafters and gatherers to where you really have to, as a player, you have to decide like which route do you want to take, which path do you want to go down, which group do you want to be friends with, and yeah, that's going to get you some benefits, but there's also going to be opportunities that you pass up because of that. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, again, making choices matter. The more places that fits into Pantheon, the better.
Yeah. Okay, and yeah, Tech Ninja went on to say a single NPC rep system, like you might have rep with the dragon, but do you have infamy with the Dragon King? So from a crafting perspective, I think it's just an extension of what I was just talking about, where, and I'll use the example of, let's say you're trying to find like fragments of a lost recipe or something, and there's that guy who knows it, but he's not going to teach it to you unless his people trust you. and you've done something for him. Like you've gone on some epic quest for him specifically. And if you so like his people think you're cool, and you've done this epic quest for him, and you pay him 1,000 gold because he's greedy, then he'll teach you the lost recipe. Like, you know, or maybe he wants to see proof of your skill. So you need to make something that's really, really amazing and give it to him so that so that he'll be willing to teach you that lost recipe. Like I could see stuff like that easily. So yeah, from that standpoint, I'm totally down with it. And that, honestly, I think that sort of thing should exist on the adventuring side as well. There should be NPCs out there that want us to fulfill stricter requirements than just having our faction at a certain level.
Zelik has a good question here. How awesome of items do you think crafters should be able to craft by comparison to raid drops? And how do you see the materials for those items being obtained when considered with the balance to difficulty to acquire?
So I'm going to flip that question around and answer it in reverse. So I want to see crafters have just as much reason to care about a raid as adventurers do. And if let's say we're taking down a raid mob in my guild as a crafter, I want to be just as excited about what that raid mob might have. And there's a couple of ways to do that, right? I talked about the idea of like you find a broken, sword hilt that you can turn with the right materials, you can turn into a really powerful item. You could also have maybe in that raid room where that mob is, maybe there's a gathering node for some really ultra rare, amazing material that could be used. And hey, we took down the raid mob. Now we can gather that node and get that material. Or you can, there's any number of different ways that you can go with this. But the idea is that there should be just as much reason for me to want to, as a crafter, to want to go on that raid as an adventurer might. And then the second part of the question, or rather the first part, is how good should the items be? Honestly, if the risk involved in obtaining those materials or creating those items is the same, then I want to see those items be just as good. If I had to go on a raid to get the drop to make the sword, then that sword should be just as good, or not identical, but at the same level as the sword that the raid encounter might have dropped on its own. And this is where the idea of customization comes into play. Actually, I would want that crafted sword to be harder to make. Like you can go get the raid drop, and it's going to always come with the lightning proc and the strength and the stamina bonus, and it's always going to have those things. But if I go get the crafting drop and I get the rare materials that I need, and then I make a sword through crafting, well, now, you know what? Maybe instead of a lightning proc, I can put an ice proc on it. Maybe instead of strength and stamina, I can put like a dexterity bonus or an agility bonus on it. Maybe I can do something really cool, like give it an enchantment so that it acts as a light source, like a torch. So it's still in the same tier, but now because I went to the extra mile to craft something and fulfilled multiple requirements, I took on a little more risk in terms of just gathering all the things I would need. Now I can customize that item and make it really unique and really powerful. It's not that it's going to be easier to craft. It's that I'm going to have to take the extra step. It's not just about looting that raid mob now, but it's about doing a bunch of other things in addition to that to make the item. So I hope that answers the question there. But that's sort of how I like to view the balance between loot and crafted items, is that if we can ensure risk versus reward, then there's no reason they can't coexist.
Yeah, especially if you're having to obtain the materials from that raid. Total sense. There's no reason why it shouldn't be as good. I like that though, that the idea of being able to customize that item, and that's the whole reason that you as a crafter are wanting to go on that raid. That's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, to take it even further, I also want to see crafters involved in raid encounters. I like to think of, and this is a side effect of me having played so many games, I'm personally kind of sick to death of raid meaning big giant monster. Now, don't get me wrong, there are times when it's really fun to fight a big giant monster. But when every single raid in the game is another big giant monster, it gets old. Um, I like to think of raids more in terms of scenarios. Like, yeah, sometimes it is about the big giant monster, but what is that big giant monster doing? Is he sitting in his cave waiting for you to come attack? Or is he like bearing down on the village, threatening to destroy everything if you don't stop him in time? And then that can, let's say that you have another raid encounter that's not a big giant monster, but maybe it's an army of orcs. And you know that you have to defeat this army of orcs because if you don't, they're going to disrupt trade throughout the region. So in order to defeat this army of orcs, you've got to take out like their 3 commanders who are spread throughout the encampment. And you have to use some strategy as a raid force to how you achieve that. The reason why I like to think about scenarios when it comes to raids is that now you can actually incorporate crafters in that. So if you're trying to slow down the big giant monster before it levels the town, well, maybe your crafters can help set up traps to slow it down, or even make some weapons to try and hinder it. A ballista with a chain attached to it to hold the monster in place and keep it from advancing for a short time. Likewise, if you're fighting that army of orcs, well, you've got to breach the walls of their fortress. How are you going to do that? Well, maybe your crafters can help you build a catapult to help knock down their gate. So yeah, like there's a lot more opportunity to involve crafters in the actual adventuring if you start thinking of these encounters as scenarios instead of just a boss in a room.
Sure, that makes total sense. Zelik brings up a good point. Why does the dragon drop dragon scale tunic? It makes much more sense for him to drop dragon scales. That you then craft the dragon scale tunic out.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, and I love Theric's idea of crafting raids. You have 48 people, working at a forge to make an item. That would be really amazing.
One of the scenarios that I've posted on the forums before when we've talked about like group crafting or crafting encounters is this. Imagine that, I'll tell you a story here. So the seas of Terminus are not a friendly place. They're racked by violent storms. There are sea monsters. There are somehow the pirates, undead from beneath the waves. Like you name it. If it's like a nightmare at sea, it's going to happen to you when you try to cross. And there's very few places where ships can cross safely. And unfortunately, if you want to cross safely, let's say from King's Reach to Whitethaw, that's a voyage of like 3 months. It's not fast. Now, you as an adventurer, you have lots of things that you need to do, so you don't want to take the slow boat to get to Whitethaw, right? Well, you can find a captain that's crazy enough to take you and your fellows across the ocean. But the catch is along the way, every bad thing that could possibly happen is going to happen to your ship. And so you're going to need not just adventurers to like fight off the sea monsters and the pirates and whatever, but you're going to need those crafters to repair the sails that get torn up by the hurricane, patch the holes in the hull before the ship sinks beneath the waves. And oh yeah, when you run aground on that island, you're going to need some gatherers to go harvest the trees to make new planks so you can get the boat back in the water. Like, it's an adventure. And crafting and keeping that ship afloat is part of that adventure. And that's just a scenario I use to illustrate like all the different ways that crafting content could work, where you can have that crafting and that combat content side by side and even relying on each other. But if you start thinking about it in terms of it's actually an adventure, it becomes a lot more interesting.
For sure, that's really exciting. Yeah, that would be really amazing. Or yeah, there's just so many different scenarios. You come to a dungeon, but there's a broken bridge, and you need to actually get into the dungeon. You need to repair the bridge to get in, or Yeah.
Yeah, or imagine that bridge is like there's a ravine, and deep in the dungeon there's this ravine, there's a bridge over it, and until somebody repairs that bridge, nobody knows what's on the other side of it.
Right.
And it could be like repairing that bridge could take a long time. It could be a lot to it. And so, you know, months later, somebody finally repairs the bridge, and this whole new section of the dungeon opens up.
Right. Very cool. Yeah, very exciting. A lot of possibilities. And Bethany points out too, or raid where again just other ways to incorporate crafters where stonemasons could seal off tunnels to keep ads from coming in on the raid. To make so if you have crafters, you end up making the raid a little easier because you're not dealing with so many. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do, and I think it really opens up. I mean, if you think about the adventure that the characters are having is basically a story that everybody is living through. When you start adding in all of these non-combat interactions alongside the combat ones, it becomes a much richer story. You can create a lot more dramatic tension and suspense. You literally have the adventurers protecting the crafters so the crafters can do whatever it is that's needed. And it's a much more cinematic kind of experience than you would normally get.
Very exciting. So, moving on to sort of well, actually, a very different topic, um, and one I haven't talked about on the show at all yet. The sort of banks in Pantheon. Um, how would you like to see banks work?
So when most of us talk about banks, we think about the bank that we had in EverQuest, or some similar game, right? Where you go to an NPC city, and there's a place there where you can store items and maybe store some coin, but you really care about the item storage. Um, and if you think about, that's what we all view banks as, right? It's item storage. It's a place to keep my stuff,
Right.
so I'm not carrying it around with me. And in the real world, banks are not really about keeping stuff, right? They're about keeping your money. Um, but I kind of want for Pantheon, I want to turn that on its head a little bit. I want to turn it sideways. I mentioned before, I played EVE Online for 11 years, and one of the really interesting things about EVE Online was that your item storage within a station was effectively unlimited. You could put as much stuff into that hangar as you wanted, and you could just always put more stuff in. But the stuff that was in that one station wasn't available in any other station unless you had it shipped there, by another player in that case. But so I would love to actually see two things happen for Pantheon. First, I would love to see banks be tied, maybe not necessarily to the individual town or city that they're in, but at least to the region. That could be the whole continent, or it could be part of a continent, like where, if I'm in Thronefast and I put stuff in the bank, it's not available to me in Cyrenai's Rest. First I'd love to see that, and that there's a lot of reasons for that. Economy is a big one, right? Because that means that if I want to take something and sell it on the other continent, I have to physically take it over to the other continent to sell it. The other piece of that, though, is that I don't want item storage to be like stupidly limited in banks. Instead, what I want is for that bank to be able to sell me more item storage for a cost. And that is not only, that means that if I want to keep 1,000 items in my bank in Thronefast, I can do that. But I'm paying a price. I'm paying a cost for that extra storage, and that acts as a money sink on the game. And it forces me as the player to make a choice, right? Is this extra item storage really worth the amount that I'm paying to have it? From a technology perspective, there's no reason that bank space has to be severely limited, because it literally is just a table and a database, and data is a lot easier than it used to be. So let's use it as a money sink. Let's have it help the economy. If somebody wants to hoard a ton of stuff, that's great. They're taking money out of the game by doing that.
Right. That's gonna be me for sure.
So yeah, that's kind of how I see banks working in the
Yeah.
game.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that idea. No, yeah. You can have as much as you want, but you definitely have to pay for it. So, you sort of talked about this a little bit, but then so we move on to how would you like to see players being able to sell to each other? You see auction house or shouting in chat? What tools would you like to see for that kind of interaction?
So kind of all of the above,
Uh-huh.
and I'll explain. I don't think there's a good one size fits all solution for allowing players to buy and sell.
Yeah.
If you just do one thing, there's always going to be some situation where that one thing doesn't really work, or it doesn't feel right to players.
Mm.
Auction houses are a great example. Auction houses are a really great way to allow players to sell to each other while they are offline without requiring them to be logged in. But the problem with that is that the transaction becomes faceless, because the player that's purchasing whatever it is, they don't know the, they don't know you as the seller, right? They go deal with that auction house NPC, and that's how they get it. And so
Right.
that's not, well, yeah, that allows me to sell stuff while I'm offline. If I'm always offline when someone's buying my stuff, that doesn't really create a social connection. At the same time, having to stay logged in and stand there and run a shout macro over and over is really a waste of time. And it's not, I mean, some people love it, but I find it absolutely like bang my head against the wall boring to do that.
Yeah.
Not to mention annoying that I have to shout over everybody else who's doing the same thing. Or as a buyer, where I have to watch that shout channel that scrolls like in 3 seconds to figure out who's selling the thing I want. That's no fun. Um, so the right answer to me is actually to have a graduated system where for commodity items, things like, harvested resources or wolf pelts or, you know, common stuff that gets used and sold in large numbers,
Hmm.
let's have an auction house style place for that, like a commodities market to borrow EQ2's term, right? It's a commodities market. And I can go my low cost stuff. I'll go put it up there, right? Hey, I'm selling wolf pelts. I put them up on the market. You buy them, everybody's happy because they're wolf pelts. Right? You don't care about who's selling you the wolf pelt. You just care that you got the wolf pelt. But let's do something more. And then for those really high value items, like that awesome sword that I made from the raid drop and the other things, those should be face to face. Like, if I'm going to sell you that kind of sword, I'm probably going to want to customize it for you to begin with. So it's not the sort of thing that I just want to put up in an auction house and say, yeah, pay me 10,000 gold and you two can have the sword, right? And so that covers kind of both ends of the spectrum, but it doesn't really cover the in between. And the part that I would use for the in between, I'm going to back up here. The best selling experience I have ever had in an MMO was in Star Wars Galaxies.
Hmm.
Because in Star Wars Galaxies, what I would do is it was attached to my player house, but I had an NPC vendor that I would put in my house, and I would decorate my little shop around them, and other players could find me on the map, come into my shop, and buy things from my NPC vendor. And it was a very fulfilling experience for me as a seller because it was my shop.
Hmm.
And people would learn the name of it, right? They would say, hey, Neff has a shop outside this city, and if you want to buy a really good blaster in Star Wars Galaxies, go to Neff's shop. And that's the kind of experience I'd love to drive for Pantheon if I had the choice, would be where for those finished items, for those, like the actual stuff that crafters really want to make, let's have like stalls in the market where that, that Theric has a stall in Fairthale. And whenever you want to buy any of Theric's stuff, because he's a really accomplished woodworker, that's where you go. You go to Fairthale, you go to the market there, you go to Theric's stall, and that's where you can get his stuff. Like, I would love to see that kind of experience cover that middle portion of the economy in Pantheon. If you want that super customized longbow, you're going to want to talk to Theric directly because it's customized, right? But if you're just looking for some really solid arrows or maybe a better quarterstaff or something, go talk to his vendor. His vendor's probably got that for you. And hey, if you just need sticks to make the arrows with, just go buy them off the commodities market. It's easy. So long-winded answer, but that's kind of what I see for player selling, is to have multiple systems that work together to provide the right experience across that range of different things that people are trying to buy and sell.
Would so the sort of the NPC vendor, would that be something that would be up 24/7 even if you're not logged in, or would you have to be?
Yeah. Yeah, and the reason for that is something we always forget is people have different amounts of time that they can be logged into the game.
Right.
Like I manage to log into games most nights and weekends, and I spend probably, when I do log in, I spend probably 3 to 4 hours at a time, sometimes more on the weekends. I know plenty of people who can maybe only log in a couple nights a week and maybe only for 1 or 2 hours at a time. It is not fair to them to say that they don't get the opportunity to sell just because they can log in less. They're already missing out on opportunities to do other kinds of gameplay, but then not being able to let them sell the things that they have been able to produce that's like kicking them while they're down. So I absolutely believe that there need to be a way for people to sell while they're offline. And if there's going to be NPC vendors, those NPC vendors need to be in-game and available, even if the player that owns them is offline.
Yeah, I like that solution. We keep talking about the time window. The general player there is going to have roughly about 2 hours, and you're spending your time crafting. You don't want to spend that 2 hours being on your vendor either. So, and then being able to sell when you're away from the computer, total sense. But I like that it's specific to your location as well. That people do have to come to you. How would people? I mean, is it just then word of mouth that people find out about Nephele and Theric's fantastic goods, or is there a way to?
Well, I think it's both word of mouth, but then you also provide tools to players to find things. Like there's a good example, if your NPC lives in a particular city, maybe there's like there's a crier or a directory in that city that allows people to see who's got vendors up and what those vendors do. Like maybe when I set up a vendor, I can give it a name, like Neff's Armor Shop or Theric's Fletching or whatever. So that people can see, like they go to the directory or they go to that town crier and they're like, oh, hey, these 3 people have armor shops. Let's go look at those. So kind of give people sort of a starting point to find the vendors that they need, but then rely on word of mouth, to take it further. As more people buy those arrows from Theric, they can, they start to learn about the quality that he has, or they know that he's always got the thing they need in stock. They tell their friends, and so now their friends come to that market looking specifically for Theric's vendor. And hey, you know what? If Theric doesn't happen to have what they need in stock one day, maybe they go to Zelik's vendor next door. And so it's kind of a combination of the two.
Right. Zelig posted another idea of a town bulletin board, where you could actually place ads, which would be another sort of possible money sink. Both I can see both selling and buying. Want ads where players could post things that they would like a crafter to make for them, possibly. You go to the town bulletin board and find out information there.
Yep.
Moving on to a completely different topic, fishing. What do you think about fishing?
Tell you what, I'm going to take about a minute break to refill my water bottle here.
Okay.
And then I'll be right back and we'll talk about fishing. So give me just a sec.
You got it. So, Kat, any thoughts? How many crafters do we have in chat tonight? Any? Oh, you hate a fishing derby. What size fish do you think you should be able to catch? Vesuvian, is there a particular type of crafting that you enjoy, or we put pressure on Theric? Oh, Delik's throwing the challenge. He's never caught anything less than 3 feet long. But what kind of bait do you use? Yeah, I'm really curious to see what type of crafting we have in Pantheon. I'm sure many people are anxious to find out the system that's going to be in place. Yeah, you got to have the fishing stories for sure, and you got to have a good beverage. You have to have a good beverage while you're fishing. I don't think I've heard anyone go fishing without a good beverage. Welcome back, just in time.
Yeah, you can't go fishing unless you've got beer. It's required.
Just saying, I don't know of anyone that goes fishing without a good beverage.
So yeah, fishing. Wow. So fishing is interesting, right? Because fishing is a type of harvesting, and I talked about earlier how I wanted harvesting to have some depth to it, right? I didn't want it to just be running around and clicking the node all the time. There should be something more some more gameplay to that. And I actually look at fishing in most games as kind of a good example because if you think about the way that fishing is implemented in most games, fishing, there's a lot of complexity to it. Like you have to use the right kind of bait, and you have to be in the right spot, and the weather has to be right, and maybe there's some other things that you have to satisfy in order to get the fish that you're looking for, and that complexity is part of what makes fishing fun. Because it's not just, hey, I'm going to go click on my fishing rod at the lake. It's the idea is that your location matters, and the tools that you use matter, and everything else matters. So I definitely want to see that. I want to see that level of complexity for Pantheon. I also, while I want to see some gameplay to it, I don't want to see something that's really twitchy, like, hey, you have to hit your button in the direction that the fish is pulling. I think that's a little too much. But I wouldn't mind seeing some buttons to push while you're fishing, so that it's not just cast the rod and get the fish back. As far as what else I would do, I think the main thing I would want is just a lot of different fish that you can pull out that have a use. I don't want useless fish. But depending on the weather, the time of day, the bait, the where you're at, like I want you to be able to get different kinds of fish, and I want those different kinds of fish to be meaningful, so that if you pull up a rainbow trout, you're like, ooh, I caught a rainbow trout, I can use it for this. But if you're somewhere else and maybe you get like a silver salmon, you're just as excited about that. And truthfully, I think the way to do that is to make fish really is to really have a very robust cooking system to go along with it, because that's where we're going to be using the majority of the fish that we catch.
Yeah, for sure.
But I don't want to see people just pulling up fish that the only thing they're good for is selling to a vendor. That's boring to me. Like, that's a waste.
Right.
So
Awesome. Someone who's really into the cooking side of crafting, I really hope you're right that a wide variety of fish and a wide variety of recipes to use them in. Also want to give a shout out. Thank you, Guitar316, for the follow. I appreciate it. Now, another change of topic. We're kind of jumping all over the place tonight. Player housing. How do you feel about player?
So let me I'm going to hit a couple things from the chat real quick that I've seen scroll by.
Yeah.
Before we dive into housing, because housing is kind of a big topic. So let me scroll up. Tech Ninja mentioned that he doesn't want to see everything be like super group required crafting. Like, he still likes the idea of being able to go out and harvest or something as sort of on his own, just as kind of a way to relax. And I'm totally with you there, man. I want to see crafting be a group activity and a social activity and gathering as well. But there should be things that you can do on your own, and they should be fulfilling and useful. So I think there's a balance to it. And it's not to say that we should go all one way or all the other, but I think there should be, there should be some things where you really do need that group, right? If you want to go get that rare material to make that really awesome weapon, you probably need a group to help you do that. But you know what? If you're just working on making like iron bars, so that you have a stock of iron bars to use for other things, like there's no reason that you need a group to go necessarily do that. So there should just be a balance, and it's about finding that right balance, something that feels good for players. My biggest thing is I just want people out in the world. I don't want them hiding in the city all the time. um, I hate games where I literally I'll log in one day and I'll see a guy sitting there crafting, and I'll log out and log in the next day and he's still in that same spot crafting. And I'm like, why? There needs to be something to get that guy to move. So that's where I'm going with that. There was another question here. Let me find it.
Well, Zelik was wondering, how do you feel about players having crafted dynamite for fishing?
Well, I mean, if you're a dwarf, it just makes sense, right? like what's with all this silly rod and bait things? Throw dynamite in the lake. But yeah, I mean, hey, if the game can support it, maybe that's the only way to get certain kinds of fish. So I don't really have a preference one way or the other, but why not? All right, so housing. So here's the deal with housing. My favorite games for housing have been Star Wars Galaxies and Vanguard, and for different reasons. Although both had some things in common. So the big thing they had in common was that their housing was in the game world. It wasn't walled off in an instance somewhere. It was in the world. If you put a house down somewhere, any other player who walked by could see your house. And I feel like that's really important, because the problem with instancing is used for housing as a way to scale it out to a larger number of players, right? Like we don't have enough land area on the map for everybody to put a house down. So we create like instance neighborhoods or whatever. And that way everybody can have their house and they can all decorate their house and everybody's happy. And we haven't like completely filled the game world with houses. So I totally get why people do instancing or why studios do instancing, but the problem with it is that housing, when you do instancing in that way, even if you do it in neighborhoods, housing becomes a personal experience for the player, and it doesn't actually have any social value to anybody else. So if I build my house in an instance, nobody else is going to care about my house, because it's in an instance and their house is probably in a different instance, and no one, unless I actually invite them over and say, hey, come look at my pretty house, they're not going to care. There's no benefit to them going to my house, and vice versa, right? There's no benefit for me to go to their house other than the ooh and ah, like the shiny things they have inside. So I prefer in-world housing for that reason. I recognize that in-world housing is really hard to do. It takes a lot of extra space in the world to make it work. So just putting that out there. If I got to design housing for Pantheon, it would be in world, but the recognition is that does require a lot of extra space in the world to do. But this is where I get into the different games. So Star Wars Galaxies, the reason that I really liked housing is because my house was useful. I could have my crafting stations in the house. I could have my NPC vendor for my shop in the house. It was a place for me to store stuff. It was my home. It was my base. Like it's where I would go when I came back from an adventure. It was, so I want that level of utility for housing. If we're gonna have housing, I want a reason to go back there. I don't want it to just be a place where I go to decorate every once in a while. I want there to be actual things that I can do in it that make it worthwhile, or make it worthwhile for other people to come visit, like having that vendor. If I think about the part I liked about Vanguard, was the way that Vanguard was arranged was that you had to build that house. It wasn't just something you plopped down and it magically appeared, right? You had to go collect all the stuff to make your house. And if that happened to be a guild hall, it was a guild-wide effort to collect all the stuff to build your guild hall. My guild in Vanguard spent something like 3 months getting all of the stuff together to build our guild hall. And it was such a cool thing when we got it done, because it was something we had literally built with our own hands. So those are two things. The third thing, I'm going to go back to Star Wars Galaxies, was Star Wars Galaxies gave you the opportunity to actually have player cities. So when you get enough players in an area, you can form a city, and now you can put down community buildings in that city. So, hey, we wanted a cantina, so we could put a cantina down, or a shuttle port, or whatever. But the idea was that all the players living together could improve their city and put down these sort of NPC services to make it, pardon me, a real city that people could go to on the map. And that was a huge deal. So bringing that all together, what I would do in Pantheon is, first of all, make sure there's plenty of land area. And I would set up housing areas very much like Vanguard had, where they were sort of arranged plots that players could purchase and build their houses on. I would have players actually build the houses. So players have to go get the materials. They're gathered, they're crafted, they're purchased, whatever. And they have to construct their house through a process very similar to Vanguard. And when it's done, you have your house, and you can have different types and sizes of houses that way. I would have a player city mechanic where, as the plots in that housing area filled up, the players would do things like elect a mayor out of the people who live there, and then all work together to contribute to community building. So, you know what? That housing area could have a tavern. You could build a tavern for your little neighborhood, your community, in your housing area, or maybe a bank, or a stable, or whatever other buildings we want to allow players to build. Guard towers with NPCs that walk around. You can do a lot of different things like that. But the idea is there have to be enough players there to support it, and then the players have to work together to make it actually built, or to get it built. And then beyond that, I would want to see players be able to use their houses for something other than just throwing wild parties. You should be able to decorate your house, and there should be lots of cool things that you can do inside. But you want to put a vendor down and turn it into a shop, go for it. Maybe you want to go get an oven and make a little restaurant, go for it. Like, do stuff like that with your house. And then finally, and this is kind of the coup de grace, I would like those player cities to actually be content generators, meaning that if you go out in the middle of the wilderness with your guild and you build a town and you start putting down things like taverns and banks and stuff, the NPCs of the world are going to take notice. And occasionally the orcs might come and try to raid your little town, or a group of bandits might come. And so make it an actual content generator that the players that live there have an incentive to defend and protect. Whether that's by building and placing NPC guard towers and making sure that the guards have equipment, or whether it's by being there themselves to stop that orc invasion from occurring, or whatever. But if you want to make housing really matter in the world, you need to give players a reason to care. And so I think that goes a long way towards giving people a reason to care about the housing neighborhood that they have settled in. Now, I realize that's a huge game system to implement. Like, that's a lot of stuff. When the land area, the construction system, the decoration system, all the stuff that has to go into that, the community buildings, the services, and then the dynamic content on top of that, that's like a full expansion. So I would not expect Pantheon to have this at launch. Like, it would take another year. But if you ask me how Pantheon should implement housing, that's what I would like to see happen whenever they do implement housing, is to that level of complexity and with that amount of gameplay attached to it.
And Alec brings up a point, and because Pantheon is going to be so successful, and we're going to see it, 10 years down the line, 5 years in, when a new player comes in and wants to build their house, how are we going to have room for them?
Yeah, that's the catch, right? And there's two things you have to do there. The first is you have to make sure there's enough land area so that there's always more places available. The second is you have to have something to pull those old houses out of the game, because players are going to stop playing. for whatever reason. And so you have to have a system that says, hey, you know what, Thorndeep, you haven't logged in like 3 months. And so your house is going to go away because you haven't logged in, or you haven't paid the upkeep on the plot, or whatever system you want to use. If you don't have that and housing just continues to pile up over time, eventually you do run out of places for players. One of the things I liked about Vanguard's original design premise, they never really realized it, but what they wanted to do was build additional housing areas on islands that players would sail to with player-owned ships.
Mm.
So the idea was you had some housing areas on the continents, but then as you explored the seas, you find these housing areas on these islands, and maybe there's something else on the island. Like maybe there's a dungeon there, or some other point of interest also on that island. So players are settling these little towns near these points of interest, and those towns are becoming sort of way stations for adventurers. Like, if your guild is going to go do the raid that's in that dungeon, you can stop in the player town on the island to get supplies before you go in, that kind of thing.
That'd be pretty cool. Yeah, definitely things for expansion down the line. So this sort of leads into my next question. What sort of tools would you like to see to help guilds, and also, I don't think we've seen this before, but tools to help player run events?
Oh yeah. So I run server events, and I've done it in every game for the last 10 years that I've played.
Mm.
I can tell you the most important thing for running a server event is having a location to do it. It doesn't have to be anything special. Like there doesn't have to be a system attached to it. But for example, let's say I wanted to do some races as a player. There should be a place in the world that I can use as a racetrack. There should be an arena somewhere in the world that I can use for those dueling competitions. It doesn't have to be one in every city or anything like that, but there need to be places that are interesting that lend themselves to different types of activities. Whether that's like, hey, there's the racetracks in this one zone, or maybe there's an arena in a different zone, or maybe there's the carnival grounds in a third zone. Like, there need to be places in the world that are really just there for players to take and use in whatever way they feel. Like, since the tavern is very often about role playing, imagine an amphitheater.
Mm.
Sitting out in some zone somewhere, and players could actually use that amphitheater to put on plays for each other. Like, you don't, or competitions or whatever else you might want to do. You have a stage and you have some seating. Do whatever you want with that. You can have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah.
So that's the first and most important thing, is just having locations available. Players can make all sorts of stuff happen if they just have a place to do it. Beyond that, it's really about communication, about giving players ways to communicate with each other in game, and get the word out about what they're doing. So custom chat channels, some sort of way. Like, if it'd be awesome if players could, if I'm going to run an event and I want to advertise that event, maybe I can put a flyer on the bulletin board in an NPC tavern somewhere, where other players can come look at that bulletin board and see that, oh, hey, there's an event happening next weekend, stuff like that. And then finally, it's really just about allowing players to express themselves. So it comes down to little things like, is there some cosmetic clothing that players can use, like to dress up? If I'm pretending to host a circus, I want to look like the circus master, right? Can players interact with furniture? So it's a dumb thing, but you wouldn't believe how many games ship and don't allow players to actually sit on chairs.
Yeah.
Like, so letting players like sit on chairs or lean against walls, or animated emotes, things like that. The more opportunities that players have to express themselves, the more interesting kinds of events that they can do. And I think that applies for guilds as well as for just players in general. Some of the best events that I have ever attended have just been things like somebody on the server decided to host a contest. like a trivia competition or something.
Mm.
And they gathered together some prizes and they had their contest, and it was fun for everybody. So there's nothing that says that it has to be super complicated. It's more about just giving people the building blocks to make these events happen.
Creating the space. If you build it, they will come, kind of idea. Going back to the housing, Zelik does point out, he likes the idea of NPCs making places undesirable. Hordes of orcs going to an area and killing people, so that housing housing starts to change.
Imagine that you as a player, right? So you and your guild have set up this little town, and unfortunately, you have attracted the attention of a lot of orcs. And on your own, you're not able to hold them off, right? Like they're starting to tear down the town and damage everybody's houses. So what do? You ask for help from the server. You're like, hey, everybody, our town is under siege by orcs. Please come help. Well, now you've not just created content for your guild, you've created content for everyone else too.
That leads in beautifully to my next question, is about looking for group tools. What sort of LFG tools would you like to see, if any, and how would you like them to work?
So the best LFG tool that I have ever used was in EverQuest, where I could say, hey, I'm LFG, and then I had a place where I could type in what I was looking for. And that was all there was to it. It was, I'm LFG, I would really like to work on this quest. I'm LFG, I don't have time for a dungeon. Or I'm looking for an XP group or whatever. Just, all these games have done all of these fancy LFG systems where you have all these little boxes you can check and do all this stuff. And I'm like, why? Just give me a place to type what I care about. And then people can send me a tell and we can talk. So I'm not opposed to like having more bells and whistles to it, but I also feel like they're not super necessary. In some ways, I think simple is better. And what I definitely don't want to see is I don't want to see anything that matches me with some other people, or teleports me into their group, or any of this dungeon finder, raid finder stuff. No, let's not go there. Just give me a way to, hey, my group is looking for more, here's what we need, or I'm looking for a group, here's what I'm looking for. And then, let me talk to other players and we'll figure it out from there.
How would you feel about an offline sort of LFG tool that, I know you said you don't want a tool that matches you with other players, but that allowed, this is for players, that don't really have friends coming into the game, but that would help match them with books of, similar play times and play styles, so that you kind of put in.
I'm all for that. So I tend to think of that more as a guild finder or a friend finder than an LFG tool.
Okay.
Like LFG to me means that I'm in the game and I'm looking for a group for something specific.
Right.
Even if that's just like, hey, I need some, I'm trying to harvest in an area, or I'm trying to level in an area, or whatever. But I'm going to tangent us here for a minute.
Sure.
So 22 years now playing MMOs. Back in 20 years ago, I would log into a game and people would talk because we were all by ourselves in the game. Like, we might have like one friend playing, but we didn't come to that game with these pre-existing groups and pre-existing guilds back in those days. It was, hey, new game, we're all new people, we're all strangers, let's get to know each other, let's have fun, let's adventure. These days, it is really rare to find somebody who is planning to play a new game that does not already have a guild or a group of friends or family members or somebody else that's going to be playing with them. And it's just the truth of it is that there's very few people coming to these games on their own anymore. And so the challenge there is, first of all, if you are somebody who comes to the game on your own, it can be really hard to meet people because they're all already busy with their own groups of people, whoever
Right.
those are. The other challenge is that if you're a small group, like maybe you're only 2 or 3 people, and you want to form a guild or do something that requires more than you have, well, now you're looking at all these other groups, and you're kind of like, well, we could join them, but are they really the kind of group we want to be in? And you don't have much to tell you. So what I would like to see there is a system that allows people to find each other, to compare, like, hey, here's how we like to play, here's our interests. And a lot of games do these guild recruiting tools that sort of get there, but they sort of don't, because we, as players, we like to put all sorts of stupid labels on ourselves, like, oh, I'm hardcore or I'm casual. Well, what does that really mean? I mean, what does it mean when I look at a guild recruitment post and I see, yeah, we're looking for mid-core players who can raid 3 nights a week, and oh, and you have to be drama free, and you're like, that, what does that even mean? Like, there needs to be, and Brad used to call it p-harmony when he talked about it, but there really does need to be a way for you to almost put up like a personal ad to say, hey, here's what my group is looking for. Whether that's my guild recruiting for new members, or my group of friends looking to join up with some other people, or even me just by myself looking to meet some new players to say, here's how I like to play the game, here's how I like to approach things, here's the time zone that I play in, all that sort of detail that helps you find those other players that you have a chance to connect with. And even then, no system is ever going to be perfect. So it's still going to be up to those players to talk to each other and get to know each other. But at least it helps you find the players to try with. And so from that standpoint, like, absolutely, there should be some kind of profile or something that we can put up. And again, it should be for even individual players all the way up to guilds to be able to do this, to help players find each other in the game. But I tend to separate that from looking for group, because looking for group to me is a very specific thing that I'm doing in the moment, as opposed to this profile idea, which is something that might be kind of in the background, that I'm just working on meeting new people as I play.
Excellent. So in regards to non-combat related content or horizontal progression, is there anything that we haven't really touched on that you're passionate about that you'd like to talk about?
Not really. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about there, but it's kind of more of the same.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is really, when it comes down to it, it's about giving people lots of different goals that they can choose to chase. So instead of having like leveling and then, oh yeah, there's all this other side stuff I can do, it's about, well, I could go level, or I could go look for an item, or I could go work on a quest, or I could go craft, or I could go do this or that. Like, if you want players in that situation where there's always more things that they could go work on or do. And I think the point is just having enough different kinds of things there so that nobody gets bored.
Right. Wide variety of content that suits you can pick and advance your character depending on how you feel that night.
Yeah.
Are there any features or mechanics you're really looking forward to in Pantheon that we've heard about?
So the thing that's got me most excited from like a feature standpoint is actually extreme climates.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to say that I personally want them to go further with extreme climates than I think they have, because I love the idea. And again, I for people that joined late, like, I tend to think about MMOs very cinematically. Like, I think about it like if I was watching a movie and these were characters in a movie, like, what would they be doing, right? So I think about, like, you're going on an adventure on a glacier in Whitethall. You probably should be wearing like heavy cloaks because you're on a glacier. You should be having to deal with like these gusting winds and blinding snow. And there should be environmental hazards like, crevasses in the ice that you can't see until you step in one and you fall, or slick patches of ice that you slip on and you slide, or avalanches that come down the mountainside. Like, when I think of extreme climates, like I think of, like really man against nature PvE kind of stuff where you're more worried about the environment and what it's doing to you than you are about that giant yeti that's about to try to eat you. Like that's what I love about the extreme climate system, and I really want them to take that as far as they possibly can. Like if I head into a lava field, maybe like around a volcano, I want to be really worried about if I step on that darker patch of rock and it crumbles and I'm suddenly like knee deep in lava, or like the lava geyser or the steam geyser, like that I have to avoid, and I have to watch for the cue to get out of the way. Like I really want that. I want it to be a cinematic kind of experience, where the me as my character, I'm really having to pay attention to the environment. So they'll get there, but that's, if you ask me what features that I'm excited about, that's definitely one of them.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely adds to the feel of the world. Going to chat a little bit. Uh, Tony says that the friend finder system can work offline, which yeah definitely makes especially if it's not an LFG tool, do that offline. Guitar, I didn't quite understand. It says it would be nice if guilds mean something again rather than just another chat box. Um,
Yeah, I
uh,
think that actually comes down to giving guilds things that they can do. So I'm not a fan. I am not a fan of requiring people to be in giant guilds in order to accomplish things. Like I feel like if somebody wants to have a small guild with just 6 or 8 or whatever of their friends, like it should be okay to do that, right? There shouldn't be this pressure to have to go have 60 people in your guild or 30 people or whatever. But at the same time, I've played plenty of games where guilds are effectively meaningless,
mm,
where because there's just nothing that the guild does that you can't do on your own.
mm,
Final Fantasy XIV is a great example of that. There is absolutely no practical reason to be in a guild in Final Fantasy XIV because you can do everything in that game without a guild. And it's not that guilds are bad, and it's really about finding the one that works for you. But at the same time, like there should be something there that is for guilds to do. Multiple somethings, right? Because it shouldn't just be about raiding,
right.
but there should be, So I would love to see not just raids, but projects that guilds could work on together. Whether that's crafting and gathering related stuff, whether it's solving these sort of big worldwide quests, raiding, of course, like any kind of gameplay we can think of. I would love to see situations where that can kind of be targeted to guilds and not just big guilds, but guilds of all sizes, right? Like, yeah, maybe you need 24 people to go raid that monster. And maybe your small guild can team up with other small guilds to do that. But your small guild can also go try to solve the mystery of the spires, and be one of the guilds to do that, and then trigger the event that comes from that. Or, your small, or maybe your medium-sized guild can be building ships that are used by players to sail between continents. Um, I see no problem with giving guilds a reason to justify their existence. And it's really just about balancing it so that players don't feel required to be in a large guild.
Right.
But if they do choose to join a guild, that there are benefits to doing so.
Cool. What characters do you plan on playing in Pantheon?
Well, this is tough because I'm an alcoholic.
I feel you.
I will have a paladin because I always have a paladin. I will have a healer of some type because I always have a healer. That might be a cleric or it might be a druid. Probably won't be a shaman. I just never can really get into shaman, but druid or cleric. And I'm kind of waiting to see what druid's going to be like so that I can decide, right? And then beyond that, I tend to create characters, and this kind of gets into roleplay. I create characters based on roleplay concepts. So, like if I identify really strongly with a particular race and class combination, and like that role player, that character concept takes a shape inside my head. It becomes like I can see a fictional character that would be that, race and class. I'll go make that character. Like, so, I might have the halfling rogue, or, the Darkmere Ranger, or whatever other combinations, because that combination really appeals to me from a role play sense. I'll go make that character and I'll play it.
Hmm.
So yeah, it kind of just depends on my inspiration, and what looks interesting and fun. And this is to get into role play a little bit. um, a lot of people role play, they come up with a story for their character, and then they want to kind of play out that story or play to that story. So like, they come up with, my character was the deposed bandit king, and he's seen the error of his ways, and he's turned a new leaf or turned over a new leaf, but now he's actually kind of a little militant about fighting crime. And so they come up with this really involved backstory, or persona,
Hmm.
and then they try to play to that. The way that I tend to role play is a little more subtle, um, where I basically just kind of put myself in my character's shoes. And so it's more based on the experiences that my character has had in the game world
Mm-hmm.
than on any story that I've kind of pre-created. Like, I might know starting out that my character is an elven druid, and I have a little bit of lore to draw on to know like what that means, that I'm an elven druid. But my character is going to evolve over the course of playing the game. And starting out, it's gonna be very subtle and even a little bit bland, because they just haven't had that many sort of life experiences yet to inform that persona.
Hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why I end up making a lot of alts, right? Because I come up with these ideas for personas, and then I want to see them evolve as I play. I want to see them grow and become stronger and stronger characters in a role play sense. And so that's what's fun for me, is sort of taking that organic approach to role playing. Now, obviously, I'm weird, and not everybody who role plays does things that way. And I think there's not a wrong way to role play. Um, it can be challenging sometimes when you're playing with people who role play differently from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I've joined role play groups before where they're all doing that big, like, heavy backstory thing, and I'm like, yeah, I don't really have a heavy backstory.
Right.
But it's just it's the way that I approach role playing in MMOs, and it's the way I always have. So
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, as someone that comes from playing D&D a lot, and in D&D you definitely well, not definitely, but you do come up with the big backstory, and there's more room to play that way because it's more interactive. But in a virtual world, it's the content is already in a sense created, and so there's not so much flexibility in terms of how the content reacts to you. So what you're saying makes total sense to me, because this is the way I role play as well. In an MMO situation, it's like, well, I just deal with the situation at hand because that's
one
all
thing,
we've got.
yeah, and so you got. Now, one thing I do love about games where things are a little slower paced, which Pantheon looks like it's going to be,
Yeah.
is it gives me the ability to have my character to actually type out what my character is saying during gameplay.
Right.
So like, I'll be in a dungeon. I used to do this in EQ all the time, and I would crack up my guildmates. Like, I would mouth off to the mobs in the dungeon. So the orc, we'd be fighting an orc or something, it'd start to cast a spell on me, and of course I'd interrupt it, and then I would type in like, "Oh no, you don't." and my guildmates thought I was hilarious, but like, that's, to me, like, that's, if you're going to role play in an MMO,
Right.
that's a fun way to do it, right?
Sure.
Is because now you're responding not just to other players, but you're responding to the world around you as well.
Exactly.
And so I'm actually looking forward to Pantheon's combat being a little bit slower, so that I have the ability to do that.
Mm.
And hopefully I'll make a lot of people laugh while I do it. So
Excellent. Well, on that note, I think we'll end the stream here tonight. I want to thank you so much. It's been a real delight to have you on and talk on a huge range of topics. And thank you to chat for everyone being so interactive and joining us in the conversation here. I really appreciate it. So Nephele, thank you again for coming on the show. And I really hope a lot of your ideas come to fruition, because I think there's really a lot of would make Pantheon a much richer place for all of us. The whole build, it really helps build the world when everything is more interconnected that way, and all the various systems sort of work and feed off of each other.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be awesome to see, not gonna lie, but I mean, it's been great talking, and hopefully, I mean, if nothing else, I hope that this inspires some of the folks who've been listening on the stream tonight. Like, think about how can you, I mean, we all have great ideas, right? We've all played these games. We all know what kinds of things are fun and meaningful and important. I think it's important for us to really talk about our ideas, even if sometimes we're going to disagree on stuff.
Sure.
Because at least in the case of Pantheon, and the developers are listening every time we talk. Every time we put a post on a forum or we do a stream like this or whatever, they're out there listening, and they're going to take the best parts of our ideas and try to make something out of those. So if nothing else, I hope you guys are all willing to share your ideas as well. Like, it's not just about people like me that get on streams and talk, but it's about all of us. It's about the whole community. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what all you guys have to say.
Yeah, well, I have to say, in regards to housing, you've really sort of switched my thinking on it. At first I was a big fan of instance housing, but I really get your point of how it draws people out of the world. And, I mean, having real world housing definitely creates a lot of issues that would need to be addressed. But it would, yeah. I'm starting. You've really made me really rethink that the housing issue for sure. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. If you ever want me to talk you to death about something, just bring up housing.
Excellent. Okay. Well, please join us in 2 weeks. I will have Basgrim on the show. Very excited about that, to talk to him about his content creation. And again, thanks everyone. I invite you all to reach out and game with someone. Take care.